Welcome to the Story Learning Podcast, regular doses of language learning tips and motivation to help you become fluent in any language. With me, Olly Richards. For language programs, books, free resources, and much more, visit StoryLearning.com. Good morning, everybody. Welcome back to the I Will Teach You a Language podcast. It's great to be back. And I'm speaking to you now from the very thick of my Italian project here in London, and I'm having so much fun. I'm not going to repeat anything that I've been talking about in my update videos because they're all there in the videos. So just head over to YouTube and search for I Will Teach You a Language if you want to follow along with what I've been doing. But suffice it to say that I'm having a really great time. And above all, I think one of the things that I'm finally managing to do with this project is actually put into practice so much of the stuff that I talk about day in, day out here on the podcast, or the kind of advice that I've been giving over years. I'm actually putting that into practice in a sustained way over time, and it's extremely interesting to see, you know. It's also making me rethink certain things. One of the things that I'm thinking a lot about at the moment, for example, is the interplay between reading and listening and how these two different skills affect your language development in different ways. I talked about that in my week 3 video, which has just come out recently. So anyway, I'm sure we'll cover these things in the future. Today, though, we've got a very interesting question about remembering vocabulary. How many words can you learn in a day? Anyway, here's today's question, all about learning vocabulary.
Hello, this is David from the Czech Republic. Currently, I'm learning English and I want to sign up for French in the next semester at my university. I usually learn 10 new words a day, but I'd like to accelerate my learning, so I'd like to learn even more words. But I'm afraid it might not be sustainable in the long term. My question is this: how many words a day do you learn? And do you think there's any maximum amount of new words we should learn a day?
Hi, David. Thank you very much for your question. And this is something that I know many people wonder. And in fact, I've been thinking about writing a blog post about this for some time. But I think it is a very difficult question to answer. And there are all kinds of related questions and topics that really sort of get into the heart of how we learn languages and also how I recommend you learn languages. So I'm going to try to not be too philosophical about this and answer your question directly, but I also can't resist giving my overall thoughts on this question. So, all right, how many words can you learn a day? I have no idea. I have no idea how many words I learn a day. I don't have a target. I simply don't. And one of the main reasons is that in language learning, it's very difficult to control the outcome. You know, it's very difficult to control what you're going to achieve in terms of results. You know, what will your fluency level be? How many words can you learn? You can't control those things. What you can control in language learning is the process, right? It's what you bring to the table. How many hours a day or a week can you study? Do you do something every day? We're talking here about the process versus the product. And so any goal really about, you know, learning a certain number of words a day, I think is very difficult to really have as a useful project. So, for example, in my Italian project right now, I had no aims at all. I was quite clear about that. But what I was very careful to stipulate and what I was very careful to decide and determine in advance is exactly what I was going to do in the project. My thoughts were, okay, I can't control the outcome. I can't control if I get to an official B2 level, but I can make sure that I do 3 hours a day. I spend an entire month getting comprehensible input, and then I speak every day from month 2 onwards. I can control all of these things, but in terms of how many words a day to learn, I really have no idea. Having said that, I think there are people that have addressed this issue, and I can tell you from my teacher training that I did many years ago. In the English language teaching world, the estimates are that you can realistically learn in one lesson, learn and retain between 8 to 12 new words. So if you want a rule of thumb, then I would say that 12 words per day is a sensible maximum. But that's as far as I'm going to go, because even that statement is highly subjective. And it comes back to the question, what does it mean to know or learn a word? If you can do it If you can memorize words on a flashcard and or for a test, that's one thing, but that doesn't mean that you can then go into a conversation and remember that word. It all depends on how you're testing yourself, and there are many different levels of knowing a word. This is one of the reasons that rote learning in general is not recommended, because in school they give you lists of words to memorize for a test, and so you kind of use all these kind of mental tricks and things to kind of remember the word for the test tomorrow, but then the next week you've forgotten it all. And the reason is that this is not a deep form of learning. The main reason I think that it's difficult to say whether or not you really know a word or how many words you can learn in a day is because it's much more complicated than that. Even if you can memorize a word, are you memorizing it against the translation in Czech, for example, David, in your case, or in English? And if so, how do you know whether you can actually use that word in a conversation? One thing is to memorize a translation of a word. Another thing is to know what word that collocates with. So, which is to say, what words often come together, right? Like happy and birthday. And so do you know all the different... Can you use that word in conversation accurately? That's the question. So the way that I tend to think about learning vocabulary is that I do my best to expose myself to as much of the language as possible through content and through speaking. And I pay a lot of attention to vocabulary. I often write it down. I'll often put it into my flashcards. I'll do things like that, but I won't have a certain aim per day. I trust in the process. I trust in a holistic process of doing lots of different skills. So reading, listening, speaking. Writing is the one thing that I tend not to do very much of, although writing is a fantastic way to grow your vocabulary because you're thinking very deeply about which words you use. So yeah, I mean, I don't want to give the impression that you can't dictate whether or not you learn stuff, because you can, and I do this regularly. So as long-term listeners to the podcast will know, I have a lot of kind of elaborate systems for memorizing vocabulary. I have an entire course, Bulletproof Memory, which is devoted to memorizing vocabulary. But one of the things about the Bulletproof Memory course, for example, the things I teach in that course, is that it's all about the process, again, not the product. So I kind of teach you the most effective way to use flashcards. I teach you the best way to use mnemonics so that things stick in your brain. But you can never guarantee that you're going to learn something today, or even that you're going to learn it next week. It's just not possible. But the one thing that really does determine whether or not you learn a word is the extent to which you are getting a lot of exposure, meaningful exposure and practice in the language. A lot of people start learning languages. I was speaking to someone just the other day who said, I'm learning German and I'm going through the memorized list of the 5,000 most frequent words in German. And you can do that. People do that. They use mnemonic devices and tricks to memorize these words. But unless you've been completely immersed in the language, you're not going to be able to use those words properly. So when you learn vocabulary, you've got to see it in the context of rich exposure to the language. And I would say if you take let's say you're spending an hour a day learning vocabulary, I would say start taking 45 minutes of that hour and instead spend it listening and reading to the language. And what you will find is, okay, you might have a slightly slower feeling of progress, but your overall progress and learning of that language will improve massively overall. Okay, so who knows if I've answered your question, David? I mean, that's certainly when I hear a question like that, that's what goes through my mind. That's my thought process. And so I hope that's helpful for what it's worth. Learning a language is so much more than how many words you know. It's so much more than how many words a day you can learn. So I think we all really need to think about language learning much more in that kind of broader context, and don't let the size of the number of words you can learn a day be the yardstick by which you measure your progress in the language. Now, if you would like to ask me a question, please go to iwillteachyoualanguage.com/ask, and there's a widget there where you can record a question directly on your phone or on your computer, just like David did, and I answer every question that comes in. providing it's respectful and relevant, and it's not can I learn 2 languages at the same time, because I've answered that about 10 million times already. So yeah, look forward to hearing your questions. Also, if you've been enjoying the podcast, I would really appreciate a rating and a review on iTunes, because this helps other people find the podcast, which ends up keeping me motivated to keep recording messages. So I would really, really appreciate it if you could leave a review. If you're listening to this on your phone, you can, these days, I think you can actually just go into the podcast that you're looking at, and certainly on the iPhone, there's a button where you can tap to leave a rating, a star rating directly, and then you can, from that, you can click through to leave a review. If you're listening on your computer, then you'd have to open up iTunes or go into the iTunes website and then search for I Will Teach You a Language, and you'll be able to do it there. Again, that would mean the world for me. To me, even. Ollie, get your prepositions right, honestly. All right, then. So at the end of every episode, I like to leave you with a resource of some kind on the topic of the show. And earlier on, well, we've been talking about vocabulary and learning vocabulary for the whole show. And earlier on, I mentioned a course that I created called Bulletproof Memory. And Bulletproof Memory is a course that I created to explore all the most popular and effective techniques for memorizing vocabulary in a foreign language, so that you can learn more words and learn them faster. But not just that, you can actually use them in conversation and know how they're supposed to be used. So if you'd like to have a look at this course, you can go to iwillteachyoualanguage.com/bulletproof memory, all one word. That's iwillteachyoualanguage.com/bulletproof memory. And yeah, I'd love to have you as part of that course. Many people listening, and many students have been through this course already, and it's always great to hear feedback from students that have been through Bulletproof Memory. But I think it's fair to say that when you start to look at learning vocabulary in a more intelligent way, everything really changes, because it's no longer just a game of memorizing as many words as possible. It's about doing it in a way that improves your overall fluency. Anyway, that's it for today. I'll see you back in the next episode of the podcast. Thanks for listening to today's episode, and in case you didn't already know, I teach languages in a rather unusual way, through stories. Now, stories are a great way to learn a new language, because when you're engrossed in a story, you remember things more easily, and the mechanics of the language just start clicking inside your brain. It's quite something, and if you'd like to find out how you can learn a new language or improve your skills in a language that you already know, and do it with the power of stories, then you should check out my free Story Learning Kit, which will teach you exactly how this method works and how you can use it yourself to learn a new language. Visit storylearning.com/podkit, that's PODKIT, to get free access. Inside, you'll find explanatory videos, masterclasses, worksheets, short stories to practice with, and much, much more. Once again, that is storylearning.com/podkit, PODKIT. And if you're lucky, you might also find a link in the podcast description or show notes of this episode.